What Trump wants is to make America great again.
I think the most obvious critique of this 100K rule is just how poorly it was communicated.
India is not necessarily the central factor in his calculations, but his vision of America is.
The government itself went back and forth on a bunch of the intricacies and nuances of the actual policy several times, causing just absolute chaos.
I think you have to appreciate that there is a fundamental transformation taking place in the US-India relationship.
I think there are going to be further hurdles to the American dream.
Hello and welcome to Track Kick Trump on DeKoder. I'm Nidhi Razdan. Well, what a week it has been yet again in the India-US relationship. This time, the US president dropping the H-1B visa bomb on India quite literally by announcing a huge change in these coveted visas and the policy related to them. Basically, now there is a $100,000 fee that new H-1B visa applicants will have to pay. This is the visa that has formed the backbone of innovation, exchanges between the two countries. So many skilled Indian tech workers, engineers, scientists who've gone to America on these visas. And the big tech giants like Google, Meta, Apple, who hired them and as a result have had huge success in their businesses, etc. So all that is now set to change. And this, of course, will have a big impact on Indians who are pursuing that American dream. It's a big blow to those who often went on these visas to America and then stayed back on and built their lives, what they thought were better lives for them and their families. But it also speaks to the fundamental issues that are sort of defining the India-US relationship at the moment. On one hand, we saw the two leaders, Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi, breaking the ice in a sense and speaking over the phone on Mr. Modi's birthday. But despite that, these stumbling blocks remain. And joining us now to try and make sense of what is going on is Dr. Ashley Tellis, Senior Fellow with Carnegie Endowment. He's with us from Washington, D.C. and has been one of the most authoritative voices on the India-US relationship for decades now. Dr. Tellis, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Nidhi. Thank you for having me.
Well, I wanted really to begin by asking you perhaps the most difficult question of all. What does Trump want from India?
Well, I think what Trump wants is to make America great again. And everything that he does with respect to India, and for that matter, the rest of the world, is really shaped and colored through the lenses of what he thinks is important for the United States. And so in that sense, India is not necessarily the central factor in his calculations, but his vision of America is. And everything that he has done in his second term has been driven by a very distinctive vision of America.
One of the things that's always stood out in the India-US relationship, even when ties were, strained in the past, was, the people-to-people links and, familial links, etc. And the H-1B visa, in a sense, became very symbolic of that, didn't it? And this decision to now have this new fee structure in place, what does it do to that innovation? What does it do, to that people-to-people relationship?
So let's go back to sort of fundamentals, right? I don't think President Trump cares very much about the people-to-people relationship between the United States and India. His predecessor certainly did, and that was colored by their appreciation of the role that Indian Americans played in American political life, in its economic life, in its cultural life. I think these things are less important to President Trump. What he has been focused on is trying to curtail immigration to the United States in all its guises, because he believes immigration constitutes a threat to his vision of the American body politic. And so what he has done with respect to the H-1B program in recent days is really part and parcel of that larger effort to roll back American immigration policies, which he believes are too liberal and which have resulted in changing the political character of the American nation. So, in some sense, although the means he used, this $100,000 H-1B fee, are sort of unorthodox, they are still consistent with his larger objective of rolling back liberal immigration. So I'm not really surprised by the fact that he did this. I think it was some time coming.
How do you also try to make sense of what has been happening in the last few weeks, if one can, because there have been so many seesaws in the relationship? But, despite the perceived thaw, the social media posts by Prime Minister Modi, the phone call between the two leaders, Trump's gone back to repeating on international platforms that he, stopped India and Pakistan from going nuclear against each other. He has done this H-1B visa thing. And you have the sanctions on the Chabahar port as well, that also happened in the last few days. So it's a bit confusing for people here to understand what's he trying to do? What is the messaging?
So I think you have to appreciate that there is a fundamental transformation taking place in the US-India relationship. In my view, it's not a transformation that is necessarily desirable or even justified. But the fact is that this transformation is occurring. And what is the foundation of this transformation? The foundation of this transformation is that Trump does not believe that the United States is involved in a great power rivalry with China, for which it needs India's support. Once this fundamental premise is accepted, that India is no longer necessary for the achievement of American aims in Asia, and especially with respect to China, then it's not surprising that India becomes a victim to the vicissitudes of different sorts, whether it's on trade, whether it's on oil, whether it's on immigration, and whatever else comes down the line. The fact of the matter is, Trump does not see India as particularly special to American interests. And this is a huge deviation from the policies of the United States for the last 20 odd years. And I think once one appreciates that this transformation is in fact occurring, a transformation of a somewhat unsettling kind, then all the rest of the things that you've described actually begin to fall into place.
It's interesting because you wrote a piece just a couple of months ago, and I just wanted to quote from that, where you said that New Delhi views Washington's attacks on its alliances and on international institutions as expanding the prospects for the emergence of multipolarity and, by implication, creating new space for India's arrival as a great power. But as you said then, this expectation is illusionary.
Right. I said that India has that expectation, that
Yes.
India has the expectation that the US attacks are creating global space for it to play a bigger role. My view is that this is really short-sighted. What in effect is happening is that the global order that the United States put in place after the Second World War, which has in fact created the conditions to support India's rise, are now under threat. And that India would find it really hard to navigate a world in which the institutions that have served it well begin to atrophy as a result of Trump's changes in policies.
In this context, then, where do you see the India-US trade negotiations going forward from here? Because they have resumed after a gap, and it's clear that Trump wants India to give up something. Now, for India domestically, politically, it will be very difficult to give any major concessions on agriculture and the sectors that America was looking to get a foothold into. But do you think it's possible that India may actually reduce or stop purchasing Russian oil if that's what it takes to make Trump happy?
So let's separate the two, because I think in the president's mind, these are two separate issues. And let me start with the trade negotiation first. I think we actually had an agreement in principle, certainly by the end of April, and formalized literally by the end of June, there was an agreement between the two sides on what a first tranche trade agreement would look like. Now, for various reasons, President Trump was dissatisfied with that agreement, and he sent his negotiators back to the drawing board to see if they could pry more concessions out of India. My understanding is that the concessions that Trump is seeking now have less to do actually with agricultural penetration. So he's not looking to penetrate the Indian agricultural market, except maybe in one or two areas. He wants to increase US exports of corn, especially corn ethanol. He wants to increase US exports of soybeans and sorghum to India. But I don't think he is pushing particularly on the complicated issues like dairy, where Indians have a certain suspicion about American dairy products because they are products that do not have purely vegetarian feed. My understanding is that he's really focused on looking at the tariffs that India has imposed on essentially industrial products. And he would like to see a trade agreement where India brings those tariffs on US industrial products to zero or as close to zero as possible. Can India do this? I think it can, but it will probably take some time, and it would probably require some segregation by either products or sectors. But from my vantage point, I think it is in India's interest to do this anyway, because Indian industry, especially at the high end now, is really competitive with the best in the rest of the world. And so it would actually enable India to have much greater export performance if it reduced the tariffs on industrial goods. Now, the challenge, of
I
course,
think,
of Mr. Modi is that there are
yeah.
important domestic constituencies that benefit from those tariffs. So it's something that he will have to negotiate inside India before he puts anything on the table, for the United States.
I think a lot of economists have made that argument as well, that this is actually an opportunity for India to look at its own protectionism and make changes there. But are you saying that in terms of what Trump may want, this aspect of what he is looking for is separate from the issue of Russian oil? Will he want both, you
Yes,
think? Or
yes,
he wants both?
he certainly wants both, but in his mind, I believe he treats these as two different items. So there are solutions that have to be reached on trade apart from oil. And that's really what Minister Piyush Goyal and his team are in the United States right now negotiating. And then there is separately the issue of Russian oil. And there he has reached the conclusion that India has unfortunately ended up subsidizing Putin's war in Ukraine. And he would like to see India essentially reduce its offtake of Russian oil again to zero. Now, I think that is an argument that I personally have sympathy with, but I still believe it is an incomplete argument. Because if the objective is to strangulate Putin's war in Ukraine, then the United States has to look at China as well, which is a much bigger consumer of Russian oil. And it also has to look at itself, because even the United States buys a variety of commodities from Russia that have the effect of subsidizing Putin's war. So if you really want to strangulate Russia, you need a much more comprehensive strategy that goes beyond simply getting India off the Russian oil bandwagon. And I don't think the president has quite done that yet, which is unfortunate.
Last couple of questions. One is, this sort of trouble in the India-US relationship comes at a time when we're suddenly seeing the US-Pakistan relationship flourish once again. Why is that?
I think it is owed entirely to President Trump's personal idiosyncrasies. I don't think there are any structural factors, as far as I can see, that compel the United States to re-engage with Pakistan today. Pakistan is not a major trade partner of the United States. It does not provide any form of material support except in very narrow areas of counterterrorism, in a way that it once did, some decade or 2 decades ago when we were deeply involved in Afghanistan. On almost every count that one looks at, Pakistan really does not figure large in US strategic calculations, except for the fact that Pakistan very adroitly played up to the president's ego after the conclusion of Operation Sindoor. And President Trump seems to have responded very fulsomely to that Pakistani effort at playing up to his ego. Now, is this a sustainable basis for a new renewal of the US-Pakistan relationship? I personally doubt that. But, because he is the president of the United States and foreign policy is very much the prerogative of the president, this policy could have a greater shelf life than is probably desirable from the viewpoint of US interests.
Finally, Dr. Ashley Tellis, how do you think India has managed to handle this and navigate this over the last few months? And what is it that India can do differently in how it deals with Trump?
So I think I must compliment the Prime Minister for handling this with a great degree of equipoise. First, India has refused to respond to US provocations, whether those provocations appeared in the form of language or in the form of tweets or in the form of statements by various Trump administration senior officials. India simply ignored them, and I think it was the right thing to do. Second, to the degree that Trump said favorable things about India or his relationship with the Prime Minister, India responded in a very full-throated way, which is what Trump likes, and which I think is a smart form of diplomacy. Third, I think the Prime Minister and his team have been very careful to keep lines of communication open with the Trump administration. And even though this has been done entirely out of the public eye, I think, again, it's a smart strategy. It's something people don't appreciate. But even at the height of Trump's tirades against India, US diplomats and Indian diplomats were consulting throughout that process. And that really is what will protect the relationship, from the worst kind of downturn that could be imagined. So if you ask me, what should India do differently? I don't think, as far as process is concerned, that India ought to do anything differently. The real issues will be on substance. And the two issues are, I think India will have to move towards reducing its offtake of Russian oil. I think India has already begun to do that. And I expect that in the next couple of months, it will bring that process to conclusion. And India can do that actually without undermining its interests, because right now there is an oversupply of oil on global markets. And so India can very easily switch from Russian sources to alternative sources. And second, I think India will have to look at its own tariff policies if we are to get a trade deal that ends up in a reduction of Trump's tariffs on India. And I'm cautiously optimistic that that too is likely to happen as a result of these current negotiations.
Well, let's see what happens. I think it's bold of you to say that India will probably reduce its purchase of Russian oil, perhaps end it altogether in the next couple of months. That's bound to invite a political backlash here. And how that plays out in New Delhi's relationship with Moscow will also be interesting to see. But Dr. Ashley Tellis, thank you very much for joining us on DeKoder today with your perspective on this big story.
Pleasure.
Well, to take us through what exactly the implications are as far as the new rules for the H-1B visas are concerned is Deedy Das. He's a partner with Menlo Ventures in San Francisco and joins us from there. Deedy Das, thank you so much for being with us. You actually have put out a pretty comprehensive sort of take on what's been happening over the last few days, the pros, the cons, and the critique of this decision. Take us through the critique first in terms of how badly this will impact Indians chasing their American dream.
Absolutely. And I just want to clarify, now it's a bit complicated. There's two H-1B things happening at the same time. There is the 100K fee, which is what I'm going to talk about. There's also wage-weighted selection as a rule, which I'm not going to talk about for now unless you're curious. Let's go through the critique. I think the most obvious critique of this 100K rule is just how poorly it was communicated. I mean, for a while, it caused absolute global chaos to everybody involved. There were people getting off flights out of SF and stopping flights because they didn't know whether they could leave the country. There were people rushing to return back on flights from their trips to wherever in the world that they were because they were under the impression that they had to be back in America by the 21st of September. And still, I mean, if you look at what happened in the next 2 or 3 days after the first announcement, the government itself went back and forth on a bunch of the intricacies and nuances of the actual policy several times, causing just absolute chaos and uncertainty for everybody involved. I mean, there was a time where it was supposed to be Howard Lutnick goes on and says in the White House press briefing, it's supposed to be an annual fee. Then they clarify and say it's a one-time fee. Some people said it was for old applicants, and they said it's not for old applicants, only new. Just a bunch of chaos when it comes to communication. So that would be my, I think, obvious and first critique. When you get into the actual details of the policy, there's a couple of other things to sort of criticize here. And I think the overwhelming one is there's two big ones that I would like to point out, or three. One is when it comes to using a monetary incentive, the kind of companies and jobs that get left out are companies that are not just paid in cash, very important roles that eventually end up being important, but currently do not pay that well. The big ones, early stage startups, nurses, and physician residents. They're paid less than 100K, pretty low sometimes, maybe just about 100K, and they're compensated either in equity or in longer term value. Those applicants get completely left at the door when it comes to a policy like this. And then real quick, the second one I will say is it's still unclear whether this applies to transfer petitions. So as an H-1B changes their job, it's unclear whether they have to pay another fee. It would be quite terrible if that was the case. The last one is, look, it's going to increase offshoring for a lot of these companies. And so does it actually help America in the long run? I mean, it's still unclear. The jury's out. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, the chaos and the confusion. And I think that's why, from all accounts, one is reading from the US at the moment, lawyers are, I think there will be legal challenges to this. They're advising clients to just be a little extra careful. I think people are still being cautious. Am I right about whether they want to come back home to India and, for Diwali or something? They'd just rather stay put, right? I mean, everyone's just so nervous about what's going to happen.
That's right. I mean, the official legal guidance for almost every immigration lawyer I've spoken to is don't travel unless you really need to. Give this a couple of weeks or months for it to play out so we can understand what's going on. Because, I mean, to be honest, everyone's utterly confused as to what the purview of this is, and only time will really clarify things. So that's what
I think
the guidance
the bigger question, though, is, I mean, for so many Indians, this has been the path to the American dream, right? Is that effectively over now?
I wouldn't say it's effectively over. I think there are going to be further hurdles to the American dream. And for a second here, if you take a step back and look at what's been happening to the US immigration scenario, Indian immigration in particular to the US is at one of the all-time highs. And this is, I've always personally also noticed a bit of a discord in rhetoric versus data when it comes to Indian immigration in this case. The rhetoric is people aren't leaving. America is a hostile environment. It's been this way for 4 years. If you look at the data, the Indian students in America in the last 5 years has not 1x, 2x, it's 3x. So in some sense, it's almost like the higher the hurdle, how far can I jump? When it comes to Indian immigration to America, the hurdles are going to keep getting higher and higher. I still think there is heavy, heavy demand for Indians who want to come to America and do their dream. This does make it harder, but it's not impossible. I mean, there are going to be companies who are going to pay the 100K fee. If you want to work at a company like an OpenAI or an Anthropic that are willing to pay large salaries to tech employees and AI researchers early on in their career, you can still do that. If you don't want to do H-1B as a route, if you want to go do a PhD and maybe do an O1, that route is still very much open. So I don't think this is a be-all, end-all, but you're right. I mean, it is a primary way. Multiple people from India were getting their visas, and it will be a harder thing to do.
Well, O1 visas are very, very difficult, and the criteria for that is tough. So it does make the road harder. But just one last question, which is that I suppose 100K fee, a Meta or a Google might still be willing to pay, but isn't it the tech startups that actually get hit the worst by this?
It is true. I mean, I think the other third category that is common is the IT consultancy firms. The tech startups, yes, they get hit. It's the earlier stage ones that I think will get hit more. I do think, for example, Jeff, which is a friend of mine, founder of a company called Exa, Series B company, he openly went out and said, look, this is not going to affect the way we hire H-1Bs. We're going to continue hiring them. We're going to continue paying the 100K. So I think it affects early stage startups. The real question mark, I think, was in the IT consulting companies. So the Wipro, Infosys, TCS, Cognizance of the world. For them, there's a couple of ways this could go. They might go and lean on the L1 program more to get talent into America. They're notorious for paying lower wages on the H-1B in non-metropolitan cities. They might also be affected. I mean, their stocks were down overnight after this ruling was announced. So the jury is out on those companies too. And about 30 to 50% of all H-1Bs are actually IT consulting companies. I would say startups make a smaller portion of that entire pie.
Well, Deedy, that's crazy times. Thank you very much for joining us on DeKoder today and giving us some perspective on what's going on and how the tech sector and the Bay Area where you are, how that's reacting to all of this. Thank you. And that's it on the show this week. We'll be back with much more to talk about next week. Who knows what will happen between now and then. See you next week. Goodbye.